Welcome everybody. Welcome to another short lecture here. Today I'm going to tell you something about some famous wars which had profound influence or impact upon the English literary history. And first of all, I start with the oldest of the wars, which is pretty familiar to all of us being students of history of English literature, the Wars of the Roses, which came immediately after the 100 Years' War during Chaucer's period. So I begin with the War of the Roses, which is the name given to a series of bloody civil wars for the throne of England between two competing royal families, namely the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Both belong to the age-old royal family named Plantagenet family. So both of them belong to the Plantagenet family, and these two royal families had, engaged themselves in a bitter struggle for the throne of England, for becoming the monarch of England. These wars were waged between the 30 years spanning between 1455 and 1485, and it got its name, the War of the Roses, because the white rose was the badge of the York family and the red rose was the badge of the Lancastrian family. After 30 years of prolonged, protracted wars and manipulation, horrific carnage or brutal butchering of people, thousands of them, and brief periods of peace, the wars finally ended, and a new royal dynasty called the Tudor dynasty finally emerged as the monarchs of England. It all began, the War of the Roses emerged, or it started with Henry VI as the King of England, who succeeded his father Henry V when he was only just 9 months old. In 1445, when he grew up, Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou from France, who was a very strong-willed woman whose ambition and political savvy overshadowed the abilities of her husband, whose interest in politics was very weak, because he himself was a very weak ruler, and his court and his rule were characterized by rampant lawlessness and corruption, and this gave an opportunity for the power-hungry nobles and kingmakers to plot behind the king's back. And Richard of York comes into the picture with a Kentish rebellion. Henry did not have enough leadership qualities, and finally the corruption and mismanagement of his power in his country England, imposing heavy taxation regime on the people, caused frustration among the property owners and peasants, particularly from the county of Kent. And led by the leader Jack Cade, these peasants and property owners, they marched on London and presented Henry with a list of demands known as a petition, better known as the Complaint of the Poor Commons of Kent. Complaints of the Poor Commons of Kent. And it was led by, remember, Jack Cade. He agreed, the ruler Henry VI agreed to some of Cade's demands, but one of which was denied. That was to recall Richard, the Duke of York, from Ireland back to England. Remember, Richard of York was the great-grandson of King Edward III, and he had a strong competing claim on the English throne. But somehow, skirmishes followed, and Henry was able to squash Cade's rebellion, and probably Jack Cade himself, he died of a mortal wound which he sustained during the fight and the subsequent arrest, and the rebellion was suppressed for the time being. But Henry's doubts were always upon Richard of York, thinking that Cade was provoked, or the rebellion was triggered by Richard of York. That was his suspicion, and in fact this started off as the War of the Roses. This rivalry set the stage for 30 years of battles for power involving the two royal families of York and Lancaster. In between, Henry VI, the king, the English king, had often suffered from bouts of insanity or madness, and by 1452 Richard of York had returned to England, who is supposedly the villain who instigated the rebellion against the king. The king believed so, but there is scanty evidence to prove this point. But unfortunately in 1454 the king, Henry VI, had the first bout of his madness, and during Henry's illness, Richard, who is now in England, who came back to England, became the Lord Protector of England, and he was ruling on behalf of Henry VI. But soon Henry recovered from his spell of insanity, and which resulted in a series of battles between the forces led by Richard of York and Henry VI, ably aided by his French wife of Anjou, Margaret of Anjou. Well, the first battle to be referred to in the case of the War of Roses is St. Albans, and I just briefly touch upon the results only. I don't go into the details. The Yorks took Henry prisoner, and Richard became Lord Protector of England. Queen Margaret and her young son, fearful of their lives, went into exile at the end of the Battle of St. Albans. There are two battles. This is the first Battle of St. Albans. Well, the second battle, which is connected with the War of the Roses, you just remember the name, the Battle of Blorhith. And in this battle, though outnumbered by half the York army or the army under Richard, they soundly defeated the Lancastrians, though they were very, very small in size. And then came the battles of Latford Bridge and Northampton. And we have to remember that the end result of these two battles was that the Yorks easily won the battle and captured King Henry, as Margaret the Queen fled once again. So he was taken prisoner. Henry VI, the king, was taken prisoner at the end of these two battles. Now comes another decisive battle connected with the War of the Roses, the Battle of Wakefield. Richard of York, he wanted to proclaim himself as the Lord Protector, and he wanted to declare that his sons will become the heirs to the English crown. And Henry, now being the vanquished, agreed because he wanted to retain his life. And this agreement was passed by the British Parliament that Richard's sons would continue to be the heirs of the British crown. This is known as the Act of Accord. Well, so at the end of this Battle of Wakefield, let us have a look at the result of the battle. The armies clashed at Wakefield Green near Sandal Castle, but things didn't work out as Richard had planned. He was killed. Richard of York was killed. His severed head was put on display, wearing a paper crown. That was the tragic end of the Battle of Wakefield. But the legacy of battle continued with further battles like Battle of Towton, and also with the Battle of Towton was the bloodiest one-day battle in English history. The Yorks finally emerged victorious, and Henry, Margaret and the son fled to Scotland, leaving Edward King of England. Well, then there is a period of transition, of power changing hands again and again between the Lancastrians and the Yorks. But somehow on May 21st, 1471, the deposed King Henry VI died, supposedly of sadness, although some historians believe that Edward had him murdered. Queen Margaret was eventually released and made her way back to Anjou in France, where she died in 1482. But as we all know, the battle finally ended with the emergence of the Tudor dynasty, and the Tudors came to power. Well, How the Tudor dynasty came to power is something that we have to have a look at. The Lancastrian Henry Tudor, with the help of France and many nobles, staked his claim to the crown of England. He met Richard, now the ruling King of England, Richard, on the battlefield at Bosworth on August 22nd, 1485. This is going to be a very decisive battle. The young Yorkist ruler Richard III was killed at the end of the battle, and Henry Tudor was declared King Henry VII, and thus began the Tudor dynasty. Rather peaceful rule for years by the Tudor dynasty. After his official coronation as the King of England, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York to reconcile the long feuding Lancaster and York houses, which brought about a kind of reconciliation. This union ended the so-called Wars of the Roses, which lasted for about 35 years with the emergence of the Tudor dynasty. Thank you all.